Salara Kothvayan stood near the cargo hold of the Valithra's Grace, and watched her husband fight a losing battle with a vacuum-sealed supply crate. And she could not help the familiar ache that rose in her chest whenever she saw him struggle with something so simple. Ethan Cole, human, former xenobiologist, and the only member of his species aboard a Carithian diplomatic cruiser carrying 400 souls through the black of deep space, pulled at the seal with both of his hands. Both of them, because that was all he had. And the muscles in his thin arms strained beneath pale skin that bruised if you looked at it too hard. She walked over and placed one of her 4 hands on the seal and pulled, and the crate popped open with a soft hiss. And Ethan stepped back and laughed, the way he always did, light and unbothered, as if the galaxy had not just reminded him once again that he was the smallest and weakest thing on this ship. "Thanks, Say," he said. Voice was warm like sunlight on water, and she loved him so much in that moment that it almost made her forget the look she caught from Dorvan across the cargo bay, the tall security officer glancing at Ethan and then away, his bioluminescent markings flickering in what Salara recognized as secondhand embarrassment. She remembered the first time she saw Ethan, 3 years ago on Vetha 4, a swamp world where the air tasted like copper, and the ground tried to eat your boots if you stood still too long. He was the only human on a joint xenobiology expedition, and while the Carithian researchers waded through chest-deep marsh with their powerful legs and 4 arms gripping specimen containers, Ethan sank to his waist and had to be pulled free twice before lunch. But he never complained, not once. And when the lead researcher could not identify a bioluminescent fungus blooming on the northern ridge, it was Ethan who recognized it. Not from any database, but from a memory of something similar on Earth, a planet so far away and so strange that most Carithians thought of it the way one thinks of a child's drawing, charming but not serious. He told her about Earth that night under a sky with 3 moons, and she listened to him describe blue oceans and white mountains and cities that stretched into the clouds, and she thought that anyone who could carry that much wonder in his voice while covered in alien swamp mud was someone worth knowing better. A ceremony performed on the Carithian homeworld under crystalline arches that hummed with harmonic light, and Ethan stood among her family in a borrowed robe that was too long for his frame. And he smiled through the entire ritual, even though Salara knew, she always knew, that her family was not smiling back. Her mother called him Etsali behind closed doors, and the word meant the soft one, and it was not a compliment. In Carithian culture, a bonded partner was expected to be a pillar, someone who could stand beside you against the dangers of an uncaring universe. And Ethan could not even open a supply crate without help. Her brother Korath refused to attend the ceremony, and her father attended but did not speak, and only her younger sister Valith embraced Ethan and told him welcome. And even then Salara saw the way Valith's lower arms stayed at her sides, a Carithian gesture of reservation, of holding something back. Salara told herself it did not matter, because she knew what they did not. She knew that Ethan was brilliant and kind, and that he laughed at things that were not funny just to make the silence feel less heavy. She knew that he read to her in the evenings from human books, filled with stories about impossible things, dragons and wizards and heroes who saved worlds not with strength, but with stubbornness and heart. But she also knew, in the quiet part of herself that she never spoke aloud, that she had arranged their quarters near the medical bay, because humans broke so easily. She knew that she always walked on the corridor side when they passed through crowded sections, because a Carithian bumping into Ethan at full stride could shatter his collarbone. She knew that she checked on him when he slept, because human hearts sometimes just stopped, without warning, without reason, like a candle blown out by a wind that no one could see. She loved him. That was never the question. but she protected him the way one protects something precious and fragile, and she never once stopped to wonder if that was the same as respecting him. The days aboard the Valithra's Grace passed in the quiet rhythm of deep space travel. Ethan spent his mornings in the hydroponics bay, tending to alien plants with careful hands, and his afternoons reading in the observation lounge, where the stars streamed past like silver rain, and his evenings with Saylara in their small quarters, where he cooked human food that tasted strange, but was made with such focus that she ate every bite and asked for more. He was happy, or he seemed happy, and Saylara held on to that the way she held on to him at night, gently, carefully, always aware of how little pressure it took to leave marks on human skin. Then the captain made an announcement over the ship-wide channel, and the quiet rhythm ended. They were entering the Shroud Expanse, a region of space between two rival empires, where law was a memory, and the darkness between stars hid things that preferred not to be seen. The crossing would take 5 days, and the captain assured the passengers that the ship's shields and escort protocols were more than sufficient. Saylara felt the familiar tightness in her chest, and looked at Ethan, expecting to see worry or fear on his face. But what she saw instead was something she could not name, a stillness, a sharpness in his brown eyes that was there for only a moment before it vanished behind his usual easy smile. "It'll be fine, Say," he said, and he kissed her on the forehead, and she believed him, because she always believed him. Later that night, she woke to find his side of the bed empty, and when she checked the ship's internal sensors, she found his location marked in the lower cargo bay, and she thought about going to find him, but decided he was probably just restless. She did not see the way he sat in the dim light of that empty bay with a private datapad in his hands, scrolling through schematics of the ship's layout. Corridor, every junction, every weapons locker, every emergency seal, memorizing them the way a man memorizes the exits in a room he does not trust. She did not hear him whisper to himself in the dark, a single word in a human language she had never learned, a word that soldiers use when they feel the weather changing before the storm arrives. She did not know him, not really, not the parts that mattered most. 2 days into the Shroud Expanse, and the stars outside had turned the color of bruises, swallowed behind walls of violet and black nebula gas so thick that the ship's sensors could barely see 1,000 kilometers in any direction, and the passengers of the Valithra's Grace moved through the corridors a little faster and spoke a little softer, the way all living things behave when they know they are somewhere they should not be. Ethan spent the morning in the hydroponics bay, his hands deep in alien soil, coaxing nutrient flows into root systems that spiraled like tiny galaxies beneath the grow lights, and the Corithian botanist assigned to the bay, an elderly woman named Thesra, watched him with 4 narrowed eyes and a curiosity she did not bother to hide. "You understand soil chemistry better than most of my graduate students," she told him, and Ethan smiled that easy smile and shrugged. "Humans have been farming for about 10,000 years, he said. "For most of that time, we did it with sticks and stubbornness, so I guess it is in the blood." Thesra's bioluminescent markings flickered warm amber, a sign of genuine respect, and Saylara, who had come to bring Ethan a midday meal, stood in the doorway and felt a complicated pride, the kind that comes with loving someone the world keeps underestimating. But the warmth did not last, because Dorvan found her in the corridor afterward, and Dorvan was never warm. He was the tallest Corithian on the ship, nearly 3 meters of dense muscle and hardened chitin-laced skin, and he served as the head of the ship's small security team, and he had made his opinion of Ethan Cole known from the first day of the voyage, not through cruelty, but through the particular kind of silence that says everything it needs to say. "I do not understand, Saylara," he said, falling into step beside her with arms folded behind his back. "And I say this not to wound you, but because I genuinely cannot comprehend it. What does he give you that a proper Curethian partner could not?" Saylara felt the heat rise behind her eyes, the anger she kept carefully stored. "He gives me himself," she said. "And what is that worth when the universe turns hostile?" Dorvan asked, and his voice carried no malice, only the clean certainty of someone who had never been proven wrong. "He cannot run as fast as you. He cannot fight beside you. His bones are hollow compared to ours. He has no venom and no bioluminescence and no natural armor. He is a creature of soft tissue and warm blood, and nothing else. And I worry for you, Saylara. I worry what happens when you need a partner, and all you have is a pet." She wanted to strike him, and the desire was so sudden and so fierce that her lower arms clenched into fists before she controlled herself, and she walked away without another word, because she was afraid, not of Dorvan, but of the tiny, treacherous part of her, herself, that could not entirely disagree. She did not go to Ethan, not yet, because she needed to calm the storm inside her chest, and so she walked the long way around the residential ring and tried to list the reasons she loved him. His laughter, his stories, the way he held her face with both hands when he kissed her, as if she were the precious one, the way he never asked to be more than he was. And every reason was true, and every reason felt suddenly terribly insufficient against the weight of Dorvan's question. Meanwhile, 3 decks below, Ethan was alone. The lower cargo bay was empty at this hour, and he had checked the schedule twice to make sure of it, and now he moved through the dim space with a discipline that would have shocked every soul aboard the Vaelithra's Grace if they had been watching. He ran first, not the clumsy jog of a man stretching his legs, but the measured sprint and recover pattern of someone who had been trained to move under fire. Then he dropped and pressed his body off the floor in sets of 50, and between sets he pulled himself up on the overhead pipe railings with smooth, controlled repetitions that spoke of years of muscle memory. Then he shadowboxed in the low light, and his fists cut the air with a precision that had nothing to do with exercise, and everything to do with remembering how to hurt someone quickly and efficiently. His breathing was hard but steady, and when he finished, he stood still for a full minute with his eyes closed, and his face was not the face Saylara knew. It was sharper, older, the face of a man standing on the edge of something he had spent years walking away from. Then the moment passed, and he wiped the sweat from his forehead and pulled on a loose shirt and walked back to the residential deck with his hands in his pockets and a whistle on his lips. And when Saylara found him in the corridor, he smiled and asked if she wanted to watch the nebula from the observation lounge, and she said yes, and held his hand, and never guessed. The next morning, the captain received a distress signal, faint, fragmented, broadcasting on a standard galactic emergency frequency. Derelict vessel, approximately 2 hours off their course, and a debate erupted on the bridge about whether to respond. Saylara was present because the biology team had been asked to consult on potential environmental hazards, and Ethan had come with her because he came with her everywhere, and no one thought twice about the human standing quietly in the back of the room. The captain, a broad and battle-scarred Curethian named Vorath, was inclined to investigate, because Curethian honor demanded response to distress calls, and most of the senior staff agreed. And the debate was nearly settled when Ethan spoke. "Captain, may I offer an observation?" he asked. And his voice was polite, but carried a weight that made the room go still, in a way Saylara had never heard before. Vorath looked at him with an expression that was 1 part curiosity and 3 parts condescension. "Speak, human." In Earth's naval history, false distress signals are one of the oldest tactics used by pirates and hostile forces to lure ships off course and into ambush positions, Ethan said, and his tone was calm and factual and utterly without ego. The signal is fragmented in a way that is consistent with artificial degradation, rather than actual system failure. The decay pattern is too uniform, and this region of space is known for exactly this kind of predatory behavior. So I would respectfully suggest that responding to this signal is a mistake. The bridge was silent for 3 seconds, and then Dorvan let out a low sound that was not quite a laugh. "The human is an expert in naval warfare now?" he said, and several officers smiled. Captain Vorath thanked Ethan for his input, and gave the order to send a scouting shuttle. The shuttle launched within the hour, crewed by 2 security officers and a pilot, and Saylara watched it disappear into the purple haze of the nebula on the long-range display, and beside her Ethan said nothing. Jaw was tight, and his eyes followed the shuttle's signal with an intensity she had never seen in him. 40 minutes later, the signal vanished. The bridge erupted in urgent voices and frantic sensor sweeps, and the communications officer tried every frequency and got nothing back, and Captain Vorath ordered the ship to battle stations, a command that sounded brave, but meant very little on a diplomatic vessel, with minimal weapons and a security team trained for crowd control, not combat. Then the proximity alarm screamed, a sound like tearing metal that cut through every deck and every corridor and every soul on the ship. And on the tactical display, 3 massive signatures materialized out of the nebula, like predators rising from deep water. HFY warships, 3 of them, insectoid raiders, with jagged hulls, and weapons arrays that glowed hot green, surrounding the Violethra's Grace on 3 sides, like wolves around a wounded animal. Saylara felt the cold flood of terror wash through her body, and she turned to grab Ethan, to pull him toward the safe rooms, to protect him the way she always did. But Ethan was not afraid. He was standing very still, with his hands at his sides, and his eyes were moving, not in panic, but in calculation, reading the tactical display, counting the enemy ships, mapping the angles of approach, and when Saylara reached for him, he took her hand gently and removed it from his arm. "Saylara," he said, and his voice was low and steady, and belonged to someone she had never met. "Where is the nearest weapons locker?" The lights died first, replaced by the blood-red pulse of emergency strips that lined the corridors like veins in a wounded body. And the ship groaned as the HFY warships locked magnetic grapples onto the hull, and began cutting through at 3 points simultaneously: port airlock, ventral cargo bay, and a section of hull plating near engineering, that screamed as alien torches burned through it, like claws through skin. Saylara could hear the screaming from 2 decks away, passengers running toward the safe rooms in the center of the ship, parents carrying children, scientists clutching research pads as if data could shield them from what was coming. And the sound was not just fear. It was the sound of people who had never imagined that violence could find them here, in the deep black, on a diplomatic vessel that had never fired a weapon in its existence. Dorvan rallied his security team at the port airlock, 8 Carethians in light armor, with plasma rifles designed more for intimidation than sustained combat, and they formed a line and waited. And when the airlock blew inward, and the first HFY poured through, Saylara saw the moment on the security feed, and understood immediately that this was not a fight. It was a slaughter. The HFY were nightmares given form, insectoid bodies covered in segmented black armor that grew from their own flesh, serrated forelimbs that could cut through steel, compound eyes that saw in every spectrum, and they moved with the coordinated brutality of a species that had evolved for one purpose and one purpose only: to take what others had built. They sprayed acid from glands beneath their mandibles, and the first 2 Carethian defenders went down screaming as their armor dissolved and their skin blistered beneath it. And Dorvan fired and fired, and his shots struck home. But the HFY kept coming, absorbing plasma burns that would have killed any other species, and within 90 seconds, the defensive line broke, and Dorvan was on the ground, with a serrated limb buried in his shoulder, and his blood, bright silver, the color of mercury, pooling beneath him. Saylara turned from the security feed and looked at Ethan. And the words she had prepared, "Come with me, we need to hide, I will keep you safe," died on her tongue. Because the man standing beside her was not the man she had married. His posture had changed in a way that was subtle but total, like watching water freeze into ice. His shoulders were set. His weight was balanced on the balls of his feet. His breathing had slowed to a rhythm that was too controlled to be natural. And his eyes, those warm brown eyes that had looked at stars with wonder and at her with love, were scanning the corridor with a focus so intense and so predatory that Saylara felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the failing life support. "Ethan," she whispered. "Saylara, I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen carefully, because we do not have much time," he said, and his voice was quiet and level and carried the weight of something long buried. "I served 12 years in the United Earth Naval Marines, 3 combat tours in the Kepler conflicts, and 2 years as a prisoner of war on Harkin 6. And I never told you, because when I left that life, I swore I would never go back to it, and I wanted you to know the man I chose to be, not the man they made me." Saylara felt the floor tilt beneath her, even though the gravity plating was still functional, and she opened her mouth but no sound came out. "I am still him," Ethan said, and for one brief moment the warmth returned to his eyes. "I am still the man who reads you stories and burns dinner and cannot open a cargo crate. But right now, that man has to step aside for a while." He touched her face with one hand, gently, the way he always did, and then he turned and walked toward the weapons locker at the end of the corridor with a stride that was nothing like the easy amble she knew. It was direct, purposeful, the walk of someone moving toward a fight they intended to win. The weapons locker held Kirithian armaments, plasma rifles scaled for four-armed giants, shock batons the length of Ethan's entire body, concussion grenades designed for hands twice the size of his, and none of it was usable. And Saylara expected him to falter, to turn back, to admit that courage was not enough. He pulled a plasma cutter from the maintenance shelf, a short-range tool meant for hull repair, and tested its beam against the wall, leaving a glowing orange scar in the metal. Then he moved to the hydroponics supply cabinet and took 3 chemical canisters, reading their labels with the speed of someone who already knew what he was looking for. Then he crouched beside the fire suppression system and removed 2 compact extinguisher grenades, and with a small multi-tool from his pocket, he cracked their casings and rewired the ignition triggers in under 40 seconds. "What are those?" Saylara asked, her voice finding itself at last. "Flashbangs," Ethan said. "Rethki have compound eyes, extremely sensitive to sudden light bursts, and their spherical respiration means airborne chemical irritants will hit them harder than us. These canisters contain a concentrated alkaline nutrient solution that will burn their breathing membranes on contact." She stared at him. "You know their biology." "I fought them before," he said, and the words were simple and heavy, and he did not explain further. He moved then, and Saylara followed, because she could not do anything else, and what she witnessed in the next 20 minutes would live behind her eyes for the rest of her life. Ethan did not fight the way Kirithians fought. He did not charge, did not roar, did not rely on size or strength, or the overwhelming force of a body designed for dominance. He fought the way water fights rock, finding every crack, every weakness, every angle that no one else would think to use. He reached a junction where 4 Rethki were advancing toward the civilian safe rooms, and instead of engaging them directly, he climbed, actually climbed, using pipes and conduit brackets that no Kirithian could have gripped, into the ceiling maintenance crawl space, positioned himself above the squad, and kicked out a ceiling panel so that it crashed down onto the lead Rethki's head. In the half-second of confusion that followed, he dropped one of his improvised flashbangs into the center of the group, and rolled away. The detonation was not loud, but the light was blinding. A white-hot flare that turned the corridor into a snapshot of frozen agony as 4 Rethki reeled backward with their compound eyes overloaded. And before they could recover, Ethan was among them with the plasma cutter, moving low and fast, striking at the joints in their armor where the segments met, not trying to overpower them, but to disable, to cripple, to take away their ability to fight, one limb at a time. The other 2 retreated, clicking in rapid communication, and Ethan did not chase them. He sealed the corridor behind them by triggering the emergency bulkhead, and moved on. At a ventilation junction near Deck 7, he paused and studied the ship's airflow schematic on a wall panel. And then he opened a series of vents in a specific sequence that Saylara did not understand until she smelled the alkaline burn of the hydroponics chemicals flooding through the air system toward the port airlock where the largest concentration of Rethki had gathered. And within minutes she heard the distant sound of choking, of mandibles clacking in distress, of a boarding force that had expected no resistance, suddenly discovering that the air itself had turned against them. He reached Dorvan 20 minutes after the breach, finding the security chief slumped behind a shattered barricade, with silver blood soaking through his uniform, and his eyes glazing with shock. Ethan knelt beside him and pressed the plasma cutter to the wound, not to cut, but to cauterize, sealing the torn flesh with a precision that spoke of having done this before, in worse conditions, on friends who did not survive. Dorvan's eyes focused, and he looked up at the human crouching over him, this small, fragile creature with blood on his hands and fire in his eyes, and the words came out broken and wondering. You are not soft." Ethan looked at him, and something flickered across his face, not pride, not satisfaction, but something older and sadder, the expression of a man who had hoped he would never have to prove this particular point. "No," he said quietly, "I am not." 3 decks above, Saylara watched on the security feed as her husband moved through the burning corridors of the ship, like something out of the old human stories he used to read to her. Not a dragon, not a wizard, but something more frightening. Nobody elected Ethan Cole to lead, and no one gave him a rank or a title or permission. But when he stood in the shattered remains of the port airlock corridor, with Dorvan's blood still drying on his hands, and laid out a plan to retake the ship, not a single Carithian in that hallway questioned him. Not because they understood what he was, but because they could see it in the way he moved and spoke and breathed. That absolute certainty of a man who had done this before and was still alive to do it again. 3 breach points, he said, drawing lines on a wall panel with the tip of the plasma cutter, scorching the layout into the metal because the digital systems were down. Port airlock is partially contained. The chemical deterrent in the air system is keeping them bottled up, but it will not last. The ventral cargo bay is wide open, and that is where their reinforcements are flowing in. Engineering is the priority, because if they reach the reactor, they can threaten to blow the ship and force a surrender. He looked at the 11 Carethians standing before him, 5 surviving security officers, 3 engineers, 2 cargo handlers, and Dorvan, who had refused to stay down and was leaning against a wall with his wounded arms strapped to his chest and murder in his 4 eyes. 3 teams, Ethan continued. Team 1 holds the civilian core. Barricade the junctions at decks 4 through 6, and do not let anything through. Team 2 retakes engineering. Team 3, with me, hits the ventral cargo bay and seals the breach to cut off their reinforcements. "And if we cannot hold?" one of the engineers asked. And Ethan looked at her with an expression that was not cruel, but was not kind either. "Then the 400 people in the safe rooms do not go home. So we hold." They moved, and the longest hour of the Veilithra's grace began. Ethan led his team, himself, Dorvan, and 3 security officers, down through the maintenance shafts toward the ventral cargo bay. And they moved in silence because Ethan insisted on it, communicating with hand signals that the Corinthians did not recognize but learned to follow within minutes, because the meaning was clear even across species. Stop, move, danger left, danger right, go. The Corinthians were stronger than him in every measurable way. Dorvan alone could have torn a Rethki apart with his bare hands if he could get close enough without being shredded by their serrated limbs. But what Ethan had that they did not was something harder to measure and impossible to teach in a single hour. He thought like prey that had learned to hunt. Every corridor they entered, he checked the ceiling and the floor and the vents before he checked the path ahead. Every junction, he paused and listened, not for footsteps, but for the faint clicking of Rethki mandible communication, a sound pitched just below the range of Carethian hearing, but within the range of human ears. Every room they passed through, he identified 2 exits before he committed to entering. And when they encountered a Rethki patrol of 6 at the junction of Deck 9, he did not engage. Instead, he sealed the corridor behind the patrol and vented the atmosphere through an emergency release. And the Rethki scrambled for breath as the air rushed out through the external emergency hatch. And by the time they activated their personal atmospheric membranes, Ethan's team had already passed the junction through a parallel maintenance tunnel and were 2 sections closer to the cargo bay. "Why not fight them?" Dorvan growled, and his voice was thick with pain and the Carethian need for direct confrontation. "Because fighting 6 of them costs time and blood, and we do not have enough of either," Ethan said without looking back. "The goal is not to kill them. The goal is to win." Dorvan said nothing, but Silara, watching from a security feed in the civilian core, where she had refused to sit idle, saw the look on the old warrior's face, and it was the look of a man whose understanding of the universe had just shifted beneath his feet. The battle at the ventral cargo bay was brutal and close, and nothing like the clean precision of the corridors. The bay was wide open, 50 meters across, and the Rethki had established a staging area around the breach where their boarding shuttle was docked. And there were at least 20 of them unloading weapons and restraint devices. Slave collars, Selara realized with a horror that tasted like metal in her mouth. Ethan did not charge into that room. He spent 4 minutes studying it from the maintenance hatch above, counting enemies, noting positions, identifying the structural weakness he needed. And then he told Dorvan his plan, and Dorvan's bioluminescence went completely dark, the Carethian equivalent of shock. "That is insane," Dorvan said. "It will work," Ethan said. "How do you know?" "Because I have done worse." Ethan sent 2 security officers to the far side of the bay to create a diversion. Noise, plasma fire, anything to draw the Rethki's attention to the wrong direction. And when the shooting started, and 15 Rethki turned to face the false threat, Ethan and Dorvan dropped from the maintenance hatch directly onto the boarding shuttle's docking clamp. Ethan used the plasma cutter to sever the magnetic seal, while Dorvan, forearmed, furious, and operating on pure adrenaline and rage, held off the 3 Rethki guards at the clamp with nothing but a broken support strut, swung like a warhammer. And when the clamp released and the shuttle began to drift, Ethan triggered the emergency atmospheric seal on the breach, and the bay roared as the pressure differential slammed the shuttle backward and out into the void, taking 7 Rethki with it. The remaining boarders in the bay were cut off from reinforcement, and Ethan's team closed in from both sides. And the fight that followed was ugly and desperate and real in a way that no training simulation could ever capture. Ethan took a slash across his left arm from a Rethki forelimb that cut to the bone, and he did not scream, did not stop, just switched the plasma cutter to his right hand, and kept moving. 40 minutes in, and the bay was theirs. 50 minutes in, and the engineering team reported that they had found the reactor, and the Rethki had mined it with explosive charges. Ethan ran, and the Carethians tried to keep up, but they were flagging. Their biology burned energy in fierce bursts and then demanded rest, and they had been fighting without pause for nearly an hour, and their muscles were filling with fatigue toxins that slowed them like poison. Ethan was also flagging. He was bleeding, limping from a twisted knee, and his breathing came in ragged gasps that sounded like tearing paper. But he did not slow down, could not slow down, because something in the human body refused to stop when the stakes were high enough. Something ancient and stubborn and utterly irrational. A biological override that whispered, "Keep going, keep going, keep going," even when every cell screamed for rest. The Corinthians saw it and did not understand it and followed it anyway. Engineering was a maze of pipes and reactor conduits, and Ethan found the charges, 3 of them, standard Rethke salvage denial devices designed to destroy a ship rather than let it be recaptured. And he recognized them because he had seen them on Harkin 6, in the prison camp. Rethke had rigged their own facility to blow rather than let it be liberated. He disarmed the first charge in 30 seconds, and the second in 20, and the third was booby-trapped, a secondary trigger connected to a motion sensor that would detonate if the charge was moved. He did not try to move it. Instead, he grabbed a reactor shielding plate and wedged it against the charge at an angle, directing the blast path toward the outer hull rather than the reactor core. And then he told everyone to get behind the blast doors, and he triggered the charge manually. The explosion tore a hole in the outer hull the size of a shuttle, and the decompression howled through engineering like a living thing, and the 4 Rethke guarding the reactor were ripped into the void along with 1,000 pieces of debris, and Ethan, braced behind a structural column with his arms locked around a support rail, held on as the air tried to tear him away. The emergency bulkhead sealed, and the silence that followed was so sudden and so complete that for 5 terrible seconds, Selara thought he was dead. Then his voice came through the comm, thin and breathless and alive. "Engineering secure. Get me power to the comms array." Selara was already moving. She had left the civilian core 10 minutes ago, despite every order to stay. And she carried with her a container of concentrated alkaline compound she had synthesized from the hydroponic supplies. A chemical irritant specifically designed to target Rethke's spiracle-based respiration. And she delivered it to the team still fighting on the upper decks. And when she reached Ethan in the wreckage of engineering, she did not recognize the corridor. And she barely recognized the man standing in it. He was covered in smoke and alien blood, green and black and silver. And his left arm hung at his side, wrapped in a makeshift bandage torn from his own shirt. And his face was bruised and cut and older than she had ever seen it. But he was alive, and he was standing, and when he saw her, his eyes softened for just one moment, before hardening again, because the fight was not over. "I need to send a signal," he said, and she helped him to the comms panel, and he entered a frequency she did not recognize. Old, analog, a relic from a human military that most of the galaxy considered primitive. And he sent a broadband distress call in a language she had never heard him speak, clipped and coded and fierce. Then he picked up the plasma cutter and walked back into the corridor, because the Rethke commander had given the order to execute the hostages taken in the initial breach. And Ethan Cole, bleeding, broken, and running on nothing but fury and refusal, went to stop it. He found them on Deck 3, 6 Rethke surrounding 11 Corinthian prisoners with their serrated limbs raised, and he came through the door with Dorvan at his side. And the fight that followed lasted less than 2 minutes, but felt like a lifetime. And when it ended, Ethan was standing over the Rethke squad leader, with a broken pipe driven through the gap in its thoracic armor, and his hands were shaking so badly that he could not let go. The marauders retreated to their remaining ships and fled into the nebula, and the Veilithra's grace drifted in the dark, wounded but alive. Selara found Ethan in a ruined corridor on Deck 2, sitting against a wall with a Kyrethian child in his arms, a little girl he had pulled from a collapsed ceiling panel during the final push. And the child was crying, and Ethan was rocking her gently, and whispering words in his own language that Saylara could not understand, but felt in her chest like a heartbeat. He handed the child to her mother, who took her daughter and stared at Ethan with an expression that needed no translation in any language. Then Ethan sat back against the wall, and he let his head fall against the metal, and he closed his eyes, and his hands, those gentle hands that tended alien gardens, and held her face when he kissed her, finally, after 90 minutes of war, began to shake. Saylara sat beside him, and said nothing, and held him the way he had always held her, carefully, gently, as if he were the most precious and the most dangerous thing she had ever known. The Yuan Steadfast arrived 6 hours after the fighting ended, dropping out of faster-than-light travel, with the quiet precision of a knife sliding from its sheath. And the Corinthians aboard the Valithra's Grace watched through the observation ports as the human frigate, angular, dark-hulled, bristling with weapon arrays that glowed faint blue in the nebula light, moved alongside their wounded ship and matched velocity with a grace that belied its brutal design. Saylara stood at the port-side observation window and watched the docking clamps extend and connect. And beside her, a Corinthian diplomat named Rashan murmured something she did not expect. "It is beautiful," he said, and he was not talking about the ship. He was talking about the speed with which it had come. The 6 hours between a distress call on an outdated frequency and the arrival of a fully armed warship in the middle of nowhere, as if the humans had been listening to the dark the entire time, for one of their own to call. The airlock opened, and the Marines came through. Saylara had seen human soldiers in recordings and briefings, but recordings did not capture the reality of them. They moved in pairs, rifles up, scanning every corner and every shadow with the same predatory awareness she had seen in Ethan's eyes when the Rethki came through the hull. And they were not large by Corinthian standards, not imposing, not frightening in any of the ways that the galaxy typically measured threat. But there was something in the way they occupied a space that made the corridor feel smaller and more controlled, as if the air itself had decided to behave. They were efficient and courteous and immediately began medical triage, setting up field stations in the main corridor with equipment that unfolded from compact cases like mechanical flowers. And they treated Corinthians and humans alike, without hesitation. And Saylara watched a human medic, a woman barely taller than Ethan, splint a Corinthian arm that was 3 times the size of her own, with steady hands, and a voice that was calm and warm and absolutely unshakable. These were Ethan's people, and every single one of them moved the way he had moved in the dark. The Marine captain found Ethan in the med bay on deck 4. Saylara was there, sitting beside the gurney where Ethan lay, with his left arm stitched and bandaged, and his ribs wrapped tight, and his face a landscape of bruises that had turned the color of storm clouds. And she did not leave when the captain entered, because she had decided she would never again step away from a part of Ethan's life, simply because she did not understand it. The captain was a tall woman, with close-cropped hair and scars on her hands that told their own stories, and she stood in the doorway and looked at Ethan, and Ethan looked at her, and something passed between them that Saylara recognized, even though she had never experienced it. The silent acknowledgement of 2 people who had walked through the same fire and come out the other side carrying the same invisible weight. The captain saluted, crisp and sharp, and Ethan, lying on a gurney in a blood-stained civilian shirt, with one arm that barely worked, returned it with his right hand. Was small, but it carried the gravity of a whole history that Saylara was only beginning to understand. "Hell of a thing, Cole," the captain said. "It was not my best work," Ethan replied, and the ghost of his old smile flickered across his battered face. "Your best work kept 400 people alive on a ship with no weapons," the captain said. "I would call that exceptional by any standard." She left to coordinate the rescue operations, and the room was quiet again. and Saylara sat in the chair beside Ethan's gurney and did not speak for a long time, because the words she needed had not been invented yet. Not in Kirethian, not in any language she knew. Finally, she said the only thing that felt true. "I am sorry." Ethan turned his head to look at her, and his eyes were tired and full of pain, but also full of her, the way they always were, and he said, "For what?" "For thinking you needed me to protect you," she said, and her voice cracked in a build way that Kirethian voices were not supposed to crack, "for walking on the corridor side so no one would bump into you, for arranging our quarters near the medbay, for every time I opened something for you, or carried something for you, or stood in front of you, as if you were made of glass. Because you are not made of glass, Ethan. You are made of something I do not have a word for." He reached out with his good hand and took hers, one of her four, the upper left, the one closest to his heart, and he held it the way he always held her, gently, as if she were the fragile one. "You were not wrong, Say," he said, and his voice was soft, the voice she had fallen in love with on a swamp world under 3 moons. "I am soft. I chose to be soft, and that choice is the hardest thing I have ever done, harder than any fight I have ever been in, because every single day I wake up, and the part of me that learned to survive wants to stay sharp and ready and afraid. I choose to put that away, and be the man who reads you stories, and burns dinner, and cannot open a cargo crate." He paused, and his grip on her hand tightened just slightly. "That is not weakness, Saylara. That is the war I fight every day, and I win it every day, and I win it for you." She pressed her forehead to his hand, and her tears fell on his skin, and they were warm and silver, and he did not wipe them away. Dorvan came the next morning, walking stiffly with his arm in a regeneration cast, and his bioluminescence dimmed to the faintest glow. And he stood at the foot of Ethan's gurney, and said nothing for a long time, and Ethan waited, because he understood that some things required silence before they could become words. When Dorvan finally spoke, he used the formal mode of Kirethian address, the one reserved for elders and warriors, and those who had proven themselves beyond any possible dispute. "I spoke against you," he said. "I called you Ethsali, and I questioned your worth, and I believed that your species had nothing to offer mine. And I was wrong in a way that I will carry for the rest of my life." Then he did something that made Sailara's breath stop. He crossed all 4 of his arms over his chest and bowed his head in the gesture of Valsethra, the warrior's acknowledgement of a superior, a ritual so old and so sacred that Saylara had only ever seen it performed twice in her life. "I will not ask your forgiveness, because I do not deserve it," Dorvan said. "I will only say that if you ever need someone to stand beside you, I will be there, and I will not hesitate." Ethan looked at him and nodded, and when he spoke his voice carried no triumph and no bitterness, only the quiet honesty that was the truest thing about him. "You were not entirely wrong about humans, Dorvan. We are fragile, we break easily, and our bodies are not built for the kind of universe we were thrown into. But that is exactly why we learn to fight the way we do. Because when you are the weakest thing in the room, you either learn to be the smartest, or you do not survive. And we have been not surviving for a very long time. Long enough to get exceptionally good at it." Dorvan stared at him, and then he laughed, a real laugh, deep and resonant, and it was the first time Saylara had ever heard Dorvan laugh at anything. The weeks that followed were filled with repairs and reports and a diplomatic uproar that rippled across 3 star systems. The Kirethian ambassador filed a formal account of the incident that was read in the chambers of the High Council, and the phrase that echoed longest was not about the Rethke's cruelty or the ship's survival. It was a single line from Captain Vorath's official testimony. "The human did what none of us could, not because he was stronger, but because he refused to stop." A formal request was drafted to open military exchange programs with Earth, and when it reached the United Earth government, it was approved within a day, and Ethan's name was mentioned in the dispatches, though he asked that it not be. Saylara called her mother and told her what had happened, all of it, and her mother listened without interrupting, which was unusual. And when Saylara finished, there was a long silence on the comm line, before her mother said, very quietly, "I would like to meet him again, properly this time." Saylara told Ethan, and he smiled, the real smile, the one she had married, said he would bring flowers, and she told him Carithians did not have a tradition of bringing flowers, and he said that was exactly why he was going to do it. 3 weeks after the attack, the Veilthra's Grace continued its journey, repaired and escorted now by 2 Earth frigates that flanked it like silent guardians, and life aboard the ship returned to something like normalcy, though normalcy had been redefined in ways that would take years to fully understand. Ethan went back to the hydroponics bay. He knelt in the alien soil, with his sleeves rolled up and his bandaged arms still stiff, but healing, and he worked the roots of a Carithian bloom vine with the same patient focus he had used to clear a ship of raiders, and he hummed a human song under his breath, something old and slow and gentle, and the plants seemed to lean toward him as if they recognized a kindred spirit, something that grew toward light no matter how dark the soil. Doorway and watched him, and she did not see the Athsali, the soft one, the fragile husband, the creature of warm blood and thin bones that her people had pitied and dismissed. She saw a man who had walked through fire and chosen, deliberately and with full knowledge of what it cost, to come back to the garden. She walked over and sat beside him on the floor of the hydroponics bay, and she did not offer to open anything or carry anything or protect him from anything, and she picked up a handful of soil and began working the roots alongside him, her 4 hands beside his 2, and they worked together in silence while the stars slid past outside the viewport like a river of light, flowing towards something none of them could see, but all of them were traveling toward. She had married what she thought was the gentlest soul in the galaxy, and she had been right. She simply had not understood until now what gentleness truly cost.